Most of us last week were watching VE Day celebrations. One aspect was to focus in on Churchill, the great wartime leader, and the one who was seen on VE Day as epitomising victory and success. Churchill, a great war leader, and Churchill, someone who stamped his picture, as we could say, on the annals of history. We reflect on what he achieved in those years. I remember as a boy at primary school watching, years later, his funeral. It was a state funeral going through London and then being held in St. Paul's Cathedral. Last week, they showed some snippets of that funeral, and it took my memory right back to when I was a boy, around 9-10 years of age at primary school. We were able to watch that whole funeral at home. It was in black and white in those days, but still I recollect being glued to the screen through the procession, the funeral, and then the barge taking his remains further out and back up to Blenheim, and then being buried in the village close beside. At primary school, we were each given one of these to remember Churchill. It's a crown, a commemorative crown. The date on it is 1965. And why we got it free, I don't know, but all of us at primary school were given one, and kept it ever since. And it particularly comes to mind now in the light of what has happened over the past few days. As a family in more recent years, we went to Blenheim Palace just as tourists, like perhaps many of you. And then after visiting the house and grounds, we went across to the little village, just a mile or so away from the palace, Bladen village, where the Churchills were buried. I wanted to see Winston Churchill's burial place, the grave. Once we went there, we saw it was marked by just a simple horizontal slab stone. That's all. And his name written on the top. No other monuments, statues, just his name on the headstone, but laid in that particular way. Struck me, here was a man who was great. He was a man who had his own foibles, but nevertheless, his works in the time of the war and elsewhere led a very important influence and effect upon the United Kingdom and on the world. His work spoke for themselves. All that he had done spoke for itself. And I suppose, in a sense, he didn't really need any further memorial or statue. Of course, statues have been erected and paintings have been done of Churchill, and you will see them in various places, especially at Westminster. But yet, they're not necessarily required. His works, what he had achieved, speaks more loudly than perhaps what we might erect to his memory. The Bible has heroes of faith. If you go into the New Testament, to the book of Hebrews chapter 11, you get a list of some heroes of faith, people who did great things for God. One of them is well known to many people, whether perhaps they know much about the Bible or not. The name is Moses. And Moses has captured people's imagination, as well as capturing those who have faith in God. Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. He took them through the wilderness for 40 years, eventually leading them into their promised land. Most of us remember some of those incidents, even from childhood, being taught about them. I want to read to you about Moses' death and his grave as a hero of faith for God. And it's in the last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34. And just a few verses. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Now, those are the final words in that book. And they remind us that here was a man who did great deeds for God, yet there wasn't even a spot to mark his grave. Perhaps there were reasons for that, but one of the things we notice is this, that we really didn't need a memorial to Moses, because what he had done has spoken more loudly down the generations, and above all what God did through him is in the lasting memory of people even to this day. Heroes of faith like Moses. And in the New Testament, we have heroes for Jesus Christ. You think of the disciples, you think of the apostles, Paul, Peter, James, John, Thomas. Where are their graves? Sometimes people may imagine that they were buried in a certain place, but their graves have disappeared from memory. And yet their names continue to be associated with Jesus Christ as those who shared their faith, and indeed what they gave for Christ speaks more loudly than how we might have erected something to their memory. Great men's works speak loudly when they're gone, but great people's works for God also speak loudly and last. And great people whom God used, or ordinary people whom God used, what they did for Jesus Christ stands and speaks more clearly than what we might build. I want to finish by summarizing that in a couple of words I learnt as a child. Now, when I quote them, you might say, well, that's a bit passé, or that's a little bit old-fashioned. My retort to that would be to say what Churchill said when some people said to him, oh, that's old-fashioned, Winston. He said, you were born in an old-fashioned way, and you'll die in an old-fashioned way. As if to say, because something is old and tested, don't feel it's outdated. Because something's old, it doesn't mean it's passé. Maybe it has been the well-tried and tested wisdom, or something of faith that speaks to every and any generation. Perhaps at this time, in what we face, that wisdom is also a spiritual truth. What was I wanting to finish with? It's just like this. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Jesus will last. And I don't think that's outdated, because it'll maybe speak more loudly than all the words that we bring as human beings, or the things that we build to another's memory.